American Ghoul, Chapter 1, Bloody Rose. The wind off the Atlantic was colder than expected. Salt and rot clung to the air like breath on old linen, and the trees, gnarled and ancient, looked nothing like the forests they'd left behind in France. The first camp was built a mile inland, past the beachhead where the shallows had taken two men with no warning, just sucked them down, bones never found. The soil here was dense with blackroot, and every clearing they carved from the trees seemed to close again at night, as if the forest had changed its mind about letting them stay. Jean Durand, a cartographer with ink-stained fingers and lungs full of ash, was the first to speak of it aloud. He'd been mapping the tree lines alone when he saw the thing half man, half corpse, its limbs too long, its mouth still working around a piece of raw animal flesh. He said it hadn't run. It had watched. The others laughed, some nervously, some cruelly. Jean was the youngest. New World fever, they said. Swamp gases. Shadows in your own mind. But 2 nights later, when the pigs were found torn open in their pen with no blood in the snow, the laughter stopped. And when Guillaume, the cooper, vanished without a cry, they sent men into the woods with torches and flintlocks. They came back with nothing but ash and stories. The natives who had watched them from the tree line approached only once. No weapons drawn, just eyes sharp with old warnings. They spoke of skinwalkers, spirits that wore dead things like clothes, of wendigos that fed on the greedy and the lost. They pointed to the trees and said the land was old and wounded, and that some things were meant to starve. But it was the priest, Father Birod, who made the connection. Bent over his Latin texts and old village tomes, he called them by another name, Ghoul. The eaters of the dead. A legend older than his own tongue, whispered about in the gutters of Lyon and Marseille, written in the margins of exorcism rites no bishop had ever sanctioned. In Europe, they'd gone underground. Into the sewers. Into stories. But here they walked. Here they fed. The colony changed after that. They built fires higher. They slept back to back. They carved wards into the trees, crosses and crude symbols from a dozen clashing beliefs. One man insisted on salt at every doorway. Another began speaking to shadows. By spring, 5 more were dead. 2 simply gone. 1 child found in pieces. And still, no screams. No sounds. Just silence, broken only by chewing. They buried their dead in iron cages, crossed their arms with blades, locked their mouths shut with wire. It made no difference. The graves were found open, always with the cage bent outward, as if what lay beneath had not been pulled out but had crawled free. A hunting party found the remains of a native village deeper in the forest, long abandoned. Bones stripped clean, some still posed around fire pits. Scorch marks on trees, like lightning had cracked through the canopy. And on one tree, burnt into the bark, a single symbol none of them could read. Not native. Not European. Something else. Something older. The stories stopped being stories. Now they were signs. Instructions. The land spoke only in aftermath. And one night, when the moon was a sliver and the wind carried no sound at all, something stepped into the firelight. Not fast. Not wild. Calm. Starving, but patient. Its eyes were hollow, and its body barely held together by skin that clung like wet parchment, twitched like it remembered how to be human, but had forgotten why. It looked at the priest, then past him, then at the fire, and it smiled, slow and confused, like it had heard a joke it almost understood. Then it vanished. No sound. No trace. Just gone. In the morning, the firewood was soaked red. And someone had placed the priest's rosary around the throat of the statue he'd carved of Saint Denis. The beads were clean. Too clean. The colony shrank after that. Not from death, but from leaving. The ships returned to Europe full of terrified men and unspeakable accounts. Of things that walk with the faces of the dead. Of bodies that do not rot. Of a wilderness that remembers everything it's ever tasted. They never returned. But the land never forgot. And neither did the ghouls. It began with denial. The first settlers to leave the coastal camps and push westward into the thick, uncut forest ridgelines of what would become Pennsylvania believed they'd left the horror behind. The reports from the shoreline colony were buried, dismissed as hysteria. Madness caused by starvation. Disease. Too much shadow, too little scripture. But it didn't stop. As new settlements broke ground in wooded valleys and along river forks, the stories followed. Disappearances in the night. Horses found torn open. Entire families vanished from their cabins, porridge still hot in the pot. The forest always took the blame. Wolves. Bears. Savages. But behind closed doors, and always in whispers, the word returned: ghouls. They weren't myths. They weren't dreams. They were everywhere. In the lowlands near the Delaware, children went missing during storms. In the Catskills, hunters found red-eyed shapes crouched over half-rotted deer, licking marrow off bone. Near the Monongahela, a preacher's daughter was found alive after 3 days missing, except her voice no longer matched her mouth. And behind her eyes, something was watching. The settlers thought they were dealing with one threat. A colony gone wrong. A cursed patch of soil. But as they moved further inland from Albany to Schuylkill, from Harrisburg to Trenton, they began to realize the truth. The ghouls were already here. Not an accident. Not a contagion. A presence, woven into the land like root systems. Some old, some new. Some that had never spoken a word of English. Some who remembered the taste of the Reformation. Some who'd arrived on the same ships as their prey. And what unsettled them more, what could not be explained away by scripture or reason, was that the ghouls were not beasts. They walked like men, spoke when they needed to, slept beneath churches, laughed, sometimes, when they fed. The colonists' faith offered no refuge. Catholics saw demons. Protestants saw punishment. The Puritans simply burned anyone who saw too much. But still, the observations stacked. The ghouls never touched cooked food. Bread, meat, broth, all left to rot. Some ghouls mimicked tradesmen. One was seen repairing a millstone in New Jersey, only to vanish into the night and later be caught chewing the bones of the man who owned it. Their eyes, when feeding, went black first, then suffused with deep arterial red like ink bleeding in oil. Their teeth were wrong. Not filed. Not carved. Born that way. Some had claws not on hands, but emerging from beneath the nail beds, as if hidden until needed. One, killed in Maryland and buried in iron chains, was found 3 days later sitting beside its own grave, eyes open, humming a hymn in a tongue no one could place. The colonists tried to categorize them. They called them cannibals by choice, savages, heretics, failed men. But somewhere, deep inside, they knew, these weren't men at all. Not anymore. The natives had never called them ghouls. They had other names. Skadagamasi, Achin, Wahuj. Names spoken only in the dark and never near children. They didn't argue over theology. They didn't debate sin. They only said this: they walk with memory but not mercy. They know hunger. That is all. And once they taste a name, it does not leave them. Still, the colonists built deeper, dug in, lit their candles and raised their flags. And the ghouls waited. Because the woods do not care for flags. And hunger does not recognize nations. That was the part no one wrote down. The part whispered only in firelight, with pistol in hand and sleep denied. The part that made men paranoid, made them carve crosses into their doors with blood instead of ash. You couldn't tell. Not until it was too late. They didn't stink of death. They didn't move like monsters. They wore boots, kissed wives, shook hands with your pastor. Unless they fed or unless they wanted to be known, you couldn't tell them from your neighbor. They prayed in your church, broke bread at your table, smiled when your child said something clever. They even laughed at the right time, nodded when the mayor raged about taxes, clapped during sermons. They looked tired, like everyone. Worn down, like everyone. Cold, hungry, devout. Until the storm hit. Until the food ran out. Until someone got lost on the road back from the Smiths. Then the eyes changed. First black. Void black. Not like ink but like absence. Then red. Not glowing, not theatrical wet red, like fresh blood lit from within. A slick hunger, not rage. Not wild. Intentional. Like something that had been pretending to be human and was finally done pretending. One settler in Bucks County wrote a letter that was never sent, still found buried beneath a burned-out cabin. It was Sarah. My Sarah. She kissed me goodnight. And when I woke, I heard her in the barn. Not moving like a woman. Moving like water in flesh. Her eyes were bleeding black. I called her name. She smiled. She said, I didn't mean for you to wake. And then she opened her mouth too wide. They didn't always feed to kill. Some just took what they needed. A bit of flesh. A child's fingers. A tooth. A piece of someone's sleep. But the more they fed, the less they remembered the performance. Eventually, they stopped talking. Not out of shame. Out of disinterest. Because why speak when the only thing left to say is you're already mine? It was a truth no settler wanted to accept. There was no way to detect them. No tests. No salt rings. No silver. No rights. Only waiting for them to slip. Or die. And sometimes, not even then. That's why some towns burned themselves. Why some churches were found boarded from the inside, filled with bones still warm. Because the terror wasn't just that monsters walked among them. The terror was that the monsters looked back. And smiled. In Europe, the ghouls were rats in cathedrals. They fed in crypts. Hid in plague carts. Made deals with undertakers and whispered to butchers' boys who'd sell scraps for silence. They wore the weight of centuries on their backs, hunted by inquisitions, bled by old magics, forced into tunnels beneath cities that forgot they existed. Every church bell was a warning. Every candle lit in a graveyard meant one more night they'd go hungry. But here, in the New World, here, there were no bells. No eyes trained to look. No scholars who remembered the old rites. No cities yet, just scattered camps and crumbling faith. Here, the ghouls didn't have to hide. They just had to behave. Smile soft. Work hard. Pray louder than the rest. And slowly, town by town, they started running things. The blacksmith with the perfect teeth who never sweated at the forge. The midwife who never aged, and always seemed to arrive before the crying started. The trapper whose kills were always fresh, even in dead winter. The preacher who never quite blinked right. They didn't need to announce themselves. They just needed the land to stay lawless long enough to grow roots. And this land was ripe. No ancient catacombs to haunt them. No blood-worn Templars on horseback. No cursed abbots with salt-laced bullets. Just fear. And hunger. And silence. Some carved out whole townships that never made it to maps. Settlements where the people never left. where the children all smiled with teeth just a little too sharp, where the crosses rotted faster than the fences. When travelers stumbled through these places, they were always fed, always welcomed, always given warm bread and meat that looked like pork, smelled like pork, tasted just a little too sweet. And always they were gone by morning. Not taken. Eaten into memory. The ghouls didn't conquer. They settled. They became mayors, midwives, judges. The ones who decided which forest was haunted, and which child needed a mercy burial. And when war came, when rebellion sparked and flags began to rise, they didn't choose sides. They simply waited. Because wars end. Borders change. But hunger? Hunger always wins. The winter of 1636 came early, biting through the woods of New England like a blade. The colonists blamed the Pequot for every snapped branch, every missing scout, every child that didn't come back from gathering firewood. But what neither side understood, what neither side could have imagined, was that something else had already begun feeding long before muskets cracked and treaties burned. Tensions between the English settlers and the Pequot were already at a boil. Trade disputes, murdered traders, territory lines drawn in soil too frozen to care. But something under it all was pushing harder, hungrier. Because with the dead piling up on both sides, so much meat was going uneaten. The ghouls came out of the trees first. The colonists thought they were native scouts until one was seen eating a corpse in the snow, hands still twitching, black and red eyes glowing like coals through frost. The Pequot, for their part, believed them to be the walking ghosts of the white men's dead. Pale-faced things that moved like smoke, carried no heartbeat, and fed in secret. But they were neither. Not truly. They were ghouls. And war was their harvest. As the conflict escalated, so did the disappearances. Soldiers vanishing between skirmishes. Scalps taken but no blood spilled. Camps found abandoned, tents ripped from the inside, bones left in piles with only the marrow missing. The Mystic Massacre in 1637, what was once known as a slaughter of over 400 Pequot in a single night, became something else in this timeline. The fort did burn. Screams did fill the trees. But the colonists who watched the blaze from the riverbanks remembered more screams than there should have been. And some of them were not Pequot. They reported seeing shadows in the flames that moved faster than any man. Things crouching in the firelight, feeding while both sides bled. A Pequot woman, half burned, crawling from the blaze and whispering in broken Algonquian, they were already there. The next day, neither side could account for all the dead. Some of the bodies were just gone. Colonist and Pequot alike began accusing each other of unnatural pacts, of making deals with the devils of the woods, of hiding something beneath their floors. But the truth was this: both sides were being hunted. And slowly, very slowly, the wiser men and women, those who lived on the edge of battle, who had seen the red eyes, who heard chewing in the dark, began to realize that this wasn't just a war of land and politics. This was a migration. Ghouls had existed in both cultures, buried deep in myth and warning. But this war? This body count? It had given them something they'd never had before: cover. The colonists built palisades. The Pequot moved deeper into the swamps. And the ghouls? They built nothing. They needed no land. Only graves. And silence. And flesh. By 1638, both the English and the Pequot were bleeding from wounds no treaty could mend. There were whispers that some warriors, Pequot and Puritan alike, had started to disappear from inside their own ranks, only to return days later, quieter, hungrier, changed. The war ended on paper. But in the woods, something else had begun. Not a battle. A seeding. And beneath the ashes of burned villages, the ghouls were still feeding. Still learning. Still waiting. Because the next war would be bigger. And bloodier. They say war makes monsters of men. But in the New World, it fed the ones already here. By the time King Philip's War erupted in 1675, the ghouls no longer needed to hide. Not truly. They didn't wear badges. They didn't sign treaties. But they were there in the woods, in the ranks, beneath the floorboards of every fort and longhouse burned to ash. Metacomet, called King Philip by the English, saw his lands trampled, his people forced to beg under foreign flags. And as tribes aligned or were crushed, he saw another kind of predator move through the bloodied forests. His war council whispered of spirits. Walkers who came at night and drank the dying. Not even the missionaries knew what to make of it. The Jesuits who dared record it left their pages unfinished. The ghouls never chose sides. They followed death. And both sides had plenty to give. Colonists reported entire militias vanishing overnight, no battle, no survivors, just bits. A single boot. A patch of torn red cloth. Finger bones in a mess tin. Native villages too, found deserted, but not burned. Just emptied. Even King Philip's own scouts spoke of hearing laughter in the dark, just beyond the torchlight, where no man dared go. In one infamous raid near Sudbury, a company of English soldiers was ambushed in the forest and overpowered, but when the tribes returned to collect arms and supplies, they found the English dead, already being eaten. And not by wolves. Blood in the trees. Stripped femurs. Something had beaten them to the kill. By 1678, both sides were exhausted, starving, fraying at the edge. But the ghouls? They were healthier than ever. And bolder. Then came Virginia. 1676, Bacon's Rebellion. A different conflict. Different soil. But the hunger found its way there too. Nathaniel Bacon and his followers lit Virginia aflame in defiance against the governor, against the elites, against peace with the tribes. But war breeds chaos. And in chaos, the ghouls don't just feed, they rise. Refugees from the frontier spoke of things in the cornfields, tall and bone-thin, dragging the wounded off before they could scream. One former indentured man claimed the marshes east of the James River were full of graves that dig themselves open. Another spoke of a rebel camp where no one aged, where the fire always burned red, never orange, where the stew tasted sweet even when no meat had been brought. When Bacon died suddenly of a fever or so, the papers said his body was buried in secret. But weeks later, his supposed grave was found unearthed, the coffin empty. No tracks. No tools. Just claw marks on the lid from inside. Some say the rebellion failed. Others say it was consumed. By the end of the decade, smart men began to realize the truth. Every colonial war left fewer humans than it should. Not just from muskets. Not just from arrows. But from predators beneath the narrative. The ghouls didn't need control. They just needed carnage. Needed men to keep fighting. To keep bleeding. To keep dying in pieces. And the wars? They weren't just political anymore. They were invitations. By the end of the 17th century, North America wasn't just a battlefield of flags, it was a continent drenched in unspoken war, the kind that didn't make it into ledgers or sermons. While Europe's kings sent ships and soldiers to squabble over land, furs, and God, something older walked the forests, untouched by allegiance, language, or border. The colonial wars, King William's, Queen Anne's, and King George's, broke the land over and over again, and the ghouls thrived in the breaking. Whenever a new fort rose, so did fresh graves. Whenever treaties shattered, families were left behind in abandoned towns, meat waiting for the night. The British accused the French of black rights. The French blamed the Iroquois. But in burned-out blockhouses from the Carolinas to the St. Lawrence, soldiers on both sides told the same stories when drunk enough or dying. The dead don't stay buried. The woods eat the wounded. The war isn't between empires. It's between us, and whatever keeps the war going. Ghouls didn't wear red or blue. They wore faces. Sometimes ones you'd recognize. Sometimes your own. By the time the French and Indian War erupted in 1754, the blood on the soil was thick enough to whisper. Entire battlefields went silent at night, not because the guns stopped, but because the feeding began. Scouts went missing before dawn. Supply caravans found gutted. One British major wrote in his journal, "The woods move when we sleep. And they do not move with men." The Haudenosaunee, once powerful, began to fracture not just from pressure between empires, but from stories inside their own villages. A child whose shadow didn't match her steps. An elder who returned from death to sit by the fire but no longer remembered any names. They did not call them ghouls, but they knew the shape of them. they'd known for centuries. They'd just lost the words. In the north, French trappers vanished in great numbers. Sometimes their canoes were found drifting downriver, loaded with untouched beaver pelts and a single jawbone wrapped in birch bark. British spies found one fort manned entirely by men who didn't blink. When the fort was seized, the victors found no bodies, only clothing and boots, stacked neatly, and a journal full of writing that bled off the page. By the war's end in 1763, the land was British. But the night was not. Something had changed. The ghouls, once hidden in the cracks of colonial chaos, now had structure. Communities. Feeding grounds. Families. No longer just carrion feeders in the aftermath of battle, they had begun to see the shape of the human world and how easily it tore itself apart. They didn't need to cause war anymore. They only needed to be there when the blood started to fall. As the British raised taxes to pay for their victories on paper, the story of empires turning screws. What they didn't realize was that in the basements of Boston and the forests outside York, other things were preparing too. Not for revolution, but for the next great bloodletting. Because when men fight over liberty, they die in pieces. And pieces feed well. It began, as it often does, with the silence after the shot. March 5, 1770. Snow still clung to the gutters of Boston. Tensions boiled in alleyways and taverns. Names were shouted, stones thrown. The British regulars turned. Muskets rose. And the first man to die, Crispus Attucks, fell into blood that didn't steam right in the cold. They called it a massacre. But no one counted the footprints afterward. No one asked why one of the wounded disappeared en route to the doctor. Or why the snow near Dock Square stayed stained red for 3 weeks as if the earth wouldn't let it go. The people roared. The colonies grieved. Pamphlets were printed. Voices rose. But in the basement of a print shop on Milk Street, something else smiled. Because revolution meant chaos. And chaos meant Meade. The leaders of the cause, Adams, Revere, Hancock, they moved like men. They spoke with passion, rode with fire, drank hard and raged harder. They called for liberty. Called for resistance. But some of them, just a few, were not what they seemed. They walked like men. But they didn't bleed like men. Their teeth were always hidden behind smiles. Their eyes never quite reflected lantern light. And they always seemed to know what the mob would do before the mob did. No one suspected. How could they? These were the heroes of the hour. The righteous. The eloquent. The bold. But behind the ink and the speeches was something else, a hunger with a plan. In Europe, ghouls had been forced underground, burned, driven into the sewers. In the colonies, they had been feeding on the edges for generations. But now for the first time they saw a future. Not one where they stayed hidden. One where they could shape the world. Boston became a powder keg not by accident, but by design. Food shortages. Barracks too close to homes. Laws passed to infuriate. Soldiers quartered in places where children whispered about men with strange eyes. The people raged. And the ghouls guided the rage. They whispered in ears. Slipped letters under doors. Fanned the flames of rebellion from the shadows. And when the time came for speeches, they stood front and center. Not because they cared about liberty. Not because they wanted to cast off kings. But because they knew the war to come would burn half a continent. And war, as always, meant mead. They didn't just want to survive history. They wanted to write it. In ink. In fire. In blood. And no one, not king, not soldier, not revolutionary, knew what they were feeding. They said George Washington never flinched under fire. That bullets missed him without reason. That he rode into ambushes and came out untouched. That in the dead of winter, when others starved and froze, he stood straight-backed, eyes forward, breath calm and even. They said he was chosen. Destined. That providence had wrapped itself around him like armor. They were almost right. He wasn't destined. He was designed. No one knew, of course. Not Hamilton. Not Franklin. Not even Adams, who would sometimes catch Washington staring too long at a fire, his lips moving in silence, like he was praying to something older than God. To the people, he was a man of virtue. Stoic. Relentless. Noble. But to the things that fed in silence, to the ghouls who watched history unfold from the shadows they knew their own. They saw it in the way he never asked for meat at dinners, only broth. In the way he buried the dead personally. In the way his eyes, just for a second in the moonlight, would go black, then red. Like something inside him had never stopped hungering, but had learned how to wait. Washington never said what he truly was. Never fed inside of others. Never allowed his mask to slip. But the ghouls who had seeded rebellion, who had whispered revolution into the ears of men they served him. Not because he commanded it, but because they feared what he was becoming. He was not one of them in the way they were used to. He did not hide in gutters. He did not scavenge. He refined the hunger. He was something older, colder, more composed. A version of the predator they forgot could exist. He didn't crave carnage. He craved order. Victory. Structure to feed from. So when the war began, when the colonies rose and the world began to bleed, the ghouls beneath the revolution all looked to him not as a general, but as their king in waiting. And Washington? He said nothing. He just mounted his horse, faced the dawn, and rode into history with the hunger sealed behind his teeth. They didn't need claws to carve history. They had steel, gunpowder, uniforms, and no one thought to look beneath the skin. The ghouls in the ranks of the revolution were disciplined, more than they'd ever been in centuries. No feeding during drills. No slips. No red eyes in the candlelight. Not unless a man was already dying. Not unless the chaos of war would cover the act. Because this war wasn't a hunt. It was a harvest. They stood in line like everyone else, shoulder to shoulder, muskets primed, bayonets fixed. From Massachusetts to the Carolinas, Ghoul soldiers learned to march in step. They bled beside humans. Died beside them. But when they were injured, they didn't die. Not unless the wound was catastrophic. A bullet to the lung? They held breath for hours. A bayonet to the stomach? They fought through it. Smiled through it. They didn't scream. More than one officer called them iron-hearted, unbreakable, blessed. But in reality, they were just tasting the shape of empire. A ghoul with a bayonet didn't need claws. A ghoul with a flintlock could still kill 3 men in the time it took a human to reload once. And when it came to night raids, they saw in the dark. They moved without breath. They climbed trees like they were stairs. One British garrison reported being attacked by silent men who bled from the eyes and moved like wolves. The report was buried. The commanding officer never spoke again. Another account from a Hessian mercenary recalled an American scout who took 8 rounds to the chest and kept charging. He laughed as he ran, the Hessian wrote. God help me, he laughed. Of course, most were careful. The rules were clear: no exposure. The revolution had to appear human. But there were exceptions. In the mud of Saratoga, a Continental soldier was seen snapping a man's spine with his bare hands after his musket jammed. At Trenton, after the river crossing, some of the Hessians weren't shot, they were devoured, mid-sleep. Washington said nothing. Only ordered the bodies buried deep and fast. The ghouls didn't win the war, but they enabled it, guided it, fed it quietly. Because in this war, they weren't the monsters. They were the foundation. And when the smoke cleared, and the flag was raised, they didn't celebrate. They just cleaned the blood from their hands, buried their own, and waited for the next great hunger. The war ended, but the hunger didn't. The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783. Bells rang in the cities. New York celebrated with fireworks and drums. In Philadelphia, men drank until the sun rose. In Boston, they paraded the streets with cries of liberty and rebirth. But beneath the cobbled avenues, in basements sealed with stone, in quiet rooms where the candles burned blue instead of gold, the real victors met in silence. There were no toasts. Just ledgers. Just maps. Just long, still glances between eyes that hadn't blinked in days. The ghouls had done it. They had helped forge a nation not in the open, but in the bones of it. Their claws hadn't drawn the borders. Their voices didn't write the Constitution, but their hands had loaded muskets. Their teeth had cleaned the battlefield, and their shadows had kept the hunger at bay just long enough for the colonies to stand on their own. Now came the harder part: maintaining the lie. Because a war was loud. But peace? Peace was intimate. In cities, people noticed more. Why the tanner never aged? Why the seamstress always worked nights? Why the tax collector's house smelled like iron and rot? So the ghouls did what they'd always done best: adapted. In Virginia, one became a banker. In South Carolina, another posed as a freedman and opened a slaughterhouse that never bought livestock. In New York, two brothers ran a publishing house. They printed tracts about civic virtue by day and coded messages for the underground by night. And in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, an entire family of ghouls posed as Quakers. Quiet, pious, never invited guests to dinner, never buried their dead in public cemeteries. But not all ghouls were content to hide. Some wanted more: to move from the fringes of the war to the core of the republic. They began watching Congress, whispering near courthouses, bribing the desperate, feeding on the enslaved, the lost, the drunk, the ones the new nation ignored. They spoke of a new order, not ruled by guns or flags, but by bloodlines. A structure where feeding wasn't a secret, but a right. Where the founding was only Act I. Some called them traitors to their kind. Others called them visionaries. They had no formal name. But in certain circles, very old, very cold ones, they were known simply as the body politic. And so the young nation stumbled forward, drunk on freedom and blind to the rot beneath its feet. The ghouls watched, waited, fed in moderation, pulled strings where they could, pulled people where they must. The hunger never stopped. It just got smarter. And somewhere, far from the cities, in a field still stained from battle, a shallow grave began to tremble. Because not all ghouls had returned from the war. Some had gone to sleep, as they did when the blood ran dry. But now the world was growing again. And it was time to wake up. The ink on the Constitution dried stiff and proud. The parchment was hoisted like scripture. The people cheered. The candles burned. But in the rooms beneath, the rooms behind the thick curtains, past the rotting stairwells, beneath Capitol stones older than the city itself, something older than liberty had taken root. Ghouls were Americans now. Not outsiders. Not parasites. Patriots. Veterans of the revolution. Stakeholders in a future soaked in blood and bureaucracy. With Washington at the helm, a creature of perfect restraint, a ghost in war form, a god in uniform. The world believed it had been founded by men. It had not. It had been founded by monsters who learned to mimic virtue. They didn't need crowns. They didn't need pulpits. They had offices. From Virginia plantations to Massachusetts courtrooms, ghouls sat at desks and read laws they would never follow. They paid taxes with counterfeit coin and smiled through town hall meetings where half the citizens were already meat. In New York, a judge who never ate in public sent men to the gallows for cannibalism. In Charleston, a congressman funded schools by night and fed on orphans by morning. In Boston, one of the first governors never took off his gloves, not because of decorum, but because the nails underneath kept growing back too sharp. They weren't hiding anymore. They were just presenting. And the government? It wasn't infiltrated. It was founded with them in it. Some humans knew. A few. The right ones. They were given privilege, wealth, long lives in exchange for silence. Others disappeared. Still others were turned, though not by bite or ritual, but by choice, by ideology, by hunger. By 1792, there was a ghoul in every state assembly. By 1800, there was one in every county courthouse. By 1820, they no longer needed to speak in code. They had legal language, infrastructure, legacy. And every time a rebellion sparked, every time a town cried foul, or a preacher shouted of demons in power, papers would disappear. Witnesses would vanish. Whole families would move away. Or stop being families altogether. The cold truth was this: America didn't fall to ghouls. It was born with them already inside. And every inch of land that bled red, white, and blue also bled. Because this wasn't a takeover. It wasn't a secret war. It was the long game. And the monsters were patient. Yes. Not scraps. Not back alley bites. Not battlefield runoff. But pounds. Clean. Measured. Legal. Ritualized. The old hunger had evolved civilized, as they said. No more hiding in churchyards, no more stealing from graves, no more creeping behind barn doors at midnight. Now they wore powdered wigs. Now they signed contracts. And now, they demanded their due. The phrasing was always delicate. Never blood. Never meat. Instead, levy, quota, correctional transfer, population redistribution. Words that bled humanity out of humanity. Prisons expanded. Poorhouses multiplied. Wars started with just enough time between them to keep the supply chains flowing. And everywhere there were systems, bureaucracies, ledgers, bodies without names the ghouls fed. Not with teeth. Not always. Sometimes it was a signature. Sometimes it was a knock on a tenant's door, saying you've missed your 4th rent payment. Sometimes it was a government-sanctioned shipment labeled unclaimed remains routed to sanitation departments that didn't exist on any map. And always, someone signed for it. Because the founding fathers had established more than a republic. They had built a feeding system. A nation engineered to bleed slowly, efficiently, perpetually. And now, centuries later, the ghouls don't lurk. They don't ask. They don't need to tear your throat open in an alley. They have a form for that. They have a judge, a badge, a flag. And somewhere, buried beneath federal archives and forgotten burial codes, is a single line of policy never voted on, never debated. Poundage in lieu of tax, where applicable. The people scream about inflation, about rent, about the cost of living. But they don't realize it's not about money anymore. It's about meat. And business is good. The Union was growing, stitched together by rail lines and compromise, trembling with westward ambition and slave-blooded prosperity. The cities buzzed with invention. The frontier groaned with promise. And beneath it all, the hunger moved quiet, smooth, practiced. The ghouls no longer needed secrecy. They needed distraction. Every bite had to be covered. Every scream had to be explained. Every body had to be placed within a narrative that fit the times. And so, they forged stories as easily as they once sharpened teeth. When a string of farmers disappeared outside Pittsburgh, the local paper blamed a rogue bear. A convenient blood trail was painted. Claw marks carved into trees by cold, smiling hands. A paw print 3 times the size it should have been pressed into the mud with a boot inside it. And the town believed it. Because it fit. Bears were real. Bears were frightening. Bears didn't walk into your kitchen, open your mouth, and rip the scream from your lungs without a sound. In Boston, when a pastor was found hanging in his rectory, his face chewed open, neck-torn, authorities printed a sanitized obituary. Reverend Thaddeus Welling, overcome by melancholia and poor spirits. The teeth marks were ruled post-mortem scavenging. The sermon he was set to give, on the corruption of the spirit in public office, was conveniently misplaced. When a whole mining crew vanished in the Alleghenies, federal agents arrived within 2 days. Not to find them to write the story. A collapse. A known shaft weakness. A map drawn, showing caves that never existed. A rescue effort launched, but never completed. God rest their souls, said the headlines. The locals who'd seen the miners' lanterns burning after the supposed collapse, who heard voices echoing too close to the surface, they were given payment for silence. Or forgotten. In New Orleans, a wharf full of immigrants was found blood-slicked and silent. The official cause? Cholera. The bodies were burned before sunrise. Quarantine enforced by men with no insignia. One reporter who got too close wrote a piece claiming something was crawling in the sewers, eating from the bones. He was later found in the Mississippi. No organs. Still smiling. And always, the same pattern. The ghoul strike. The body drop. The panic. The story. Carefully constructed, signed in triplicate, sent to local papers, spread with conviction. A factory fire. A rabid animal. Slave revolt. Swamp sickness. Railroad accident. Rogue frontiersman. Religious hysteria. No matter the hole in the chest, the bloodless spine, the eyes missing but the face intact. There was always an explanation. Because now the ghouls had narrative control. And what is history, if not the version written by the ones who weren't eaten? By the time the country split in two, the ghouls had already counted the bodies. The Civil War was not an accident to them. It was a harvest carefully engineered over decades. They fed on chaos, on lawlessness, on silence, and war. War was the perfect silence. Slavery had always been a smokescreen to the ghouls, not morally, but functionally. It created unquestioned death, a steady stream of unmarked, unsearched, uninvestigated flesh. The plantations were feeding grounds, wrapped in doctrine and distance. But as abolition began to spread and resistance grew, the ghouls saw something else. Conflict approaching critical mass. So they fanned it. In southern legislatures, ghoul-aligned lawmakers inflamed rhetoric. Pamphlets printed in secret shops whispered poison to both sides. Railways were redirected. Weapons lost. Communications confused. And when the first shots rang out at Fort Sumter in 1861, they were already waiting in the woods. But what followed wasn't just war. It was escalation. Officially, about 620,000 people died in the American Civil War. Some estimates put it closer to 750,000 in our timeline. But here, the real number was over 1.5 million. Because for every soldier killed in battle, there were others. Men listed as deserters who never made it to the next town. Entire platoons that vanished during fog-bound marches. Field hospitals overrun not by disease, but by things with eyes black and red. There were accidental supply delays that left Union troops starving on the march. Misrouted Confederate reinforcements that arrived days late because they'd been redirected into ghoul territory. A particularly infamous incident at Cold Harbor had thousands of bodies disappear overnight. It was blamed on bad record keeping. In truth, the feeding pits overflowed. On both sides, ghoul sympathizers infiltrated the ranks. They wore blue. They wore gray. They carried orders in one pocket, and tithes of flesh in the other. One general whose name was later erased from official record deliberately sent cavalry into a swamp that had already swallowed 3 units. Not a single scream. Not a single body recovered. Just buttons in the mud, and blood that never dried. Wartime chaos made death routine. And routine death meant unquestioned disappearance. The ghouls raised the death toll by anywhere from 35 to 68% depending on region. They preyed especially hard in the Shenandoah Valley, the swamps of Georgia, The battlefields of Tennessee. The rural hinterlands outside Gettysburg, where one entire artillery company was lost in the dark. They didn't just feed. They shaped the war. Kept it going. Longer than it had to. Bloodier than it should have been. They fed in the shadows of every flag. And the best part? History recorded it for them. All nice and clean. By 1865, the country was broken, bled out, and grieving. And the ghouls were stronger than they'd ever been. Not only had they culled the herd, they had also secured deeper positions in state and federal governments, taken over dozens of post-war reconstruction contracts, assumed control of hospitals, morgues, and prison systems, invented and instituted new forensic science to explain away what their feeding left behind. The public wept over brother killing brother. But the ghouls? They toasted in crypts. Because the Civil War wasn't their tragedy. It was their feast. Where our timeline saw Reconstruction as a half-hearted effort to bind wounds, the ghouls saw it as expansion. Not of liberty. Not of justice. But of supply. They didn't suppress tension. They stoked it, quietly, efficiently, behind closed doors and through smiling bureaucrats. And they did it under a mask no one questioned: progress. The pitch was simple. Bring more freed Africans over. Give them land. Opportunity. Citizenship. Let them build. Let them hope. And let the public see it. It wasn't generosity. It wasn't justice. It was strategy. More bodies. More names. More conflict to sow between groups: white, black, poor, newly arrived, deeply rooted. And in the confusion, more meat to vanish. The ghouls lobbied for new territories to be opened west of the Mississippi, south of Illinois, under banners that hadn't existed before the war. They formed integrationist commissions, complete with ghoul-appointed officials who spoke fluently about the future of a united nation. But what they really pushed for was settlement clusters. Whole counties set aside for newly arrived African families. Old Confederate land grants handed off like gifts. Freedmen's towns built just far enough from protection. And the people starving, orphaned, desperate for promise came. Tens of thousands. Whole shiploads from West Africa. Others pulled from the Caribbean. Sold the idea that America was different now. And at first, it seemed true. They were given land, tools, even arms to protect themselves. But the protection was an illusion. Because those towns were never meant to grow. They were meant to feed. When riots broke out, when poor whites were incited with ginned-up rage about land and wages, when militia groups spontaneously burned black townships to the ground, no one questioned where the extra guns came from. No one asked why federal reinforcements arrived too late. or how so many attackers moved with military precision. In more than one instance, investigators discovered that both the settlers and the burners had received payment from the same northern bank. A bank whose ledgers were written in handwriting no one recognized. The result: bodies. Hundreds. Then thousands. Many unclaimed. Many unburied. Many disappeared. And each time the nation mourned another atrocity, another town, another massacre. The ghouls tallied it like a harvest ledger. Not just in blood, but in control. More chaos meant more justification for intervention. More intervention meant more infrastructure. More infrastructure meant deeper feeding pipelines, hospitals, jails, work camps, rail lines. In this timeline, the great post-war migration wasn't one of desperation. It was a strategic offering. The government extended its hand with a smile. And in the dark, the other hand sharpened its claws. Because the ghouls weren't trying to fix America. They were trying to feed a nation into itself. One scream at a time. One town at a time. One promised future turned into meat. And that's the genius of it. Not just the brutality. Not just the hunger. But the presentation. The American people aren't just prey in this version of history, they're participants in their own concealment. Kept busy with manufactured outrage, terrified of shadows their own government casts with surgical precision. Every rising ghoul sighting? Every corpse found mangled in an alley? Every child vanished without a trace? All of it folded into the narrative machine. By the late 1800s, Ghoul had become an urban legend. A slur. A joke. A monster under the bed. Newspapers ran contradictory reports: ghouls as immigrants, ghouls as cultists, ghouls as escaped lunatics. Sometimes ghoul became interchangeable with criminal. And the best part? The public helped bury the truth. Because no one wants to believe the nightmare. No one wants to think the people wearing badges, holding gavels, sitting in the White House are the very things feasting on their children. So when body after body showed up in the streets of Chicago, St. Louis, New York, ripped open with surgical efficiency, flesh missing, bones picked clean, the people cried for justice. And the government delivered. Task forces, ghoul enforcement bureaus, state-sanctioned raids on suspected nests, new laws, new prisons, new stories. They burned down condemned buildings, hanged supposed cultists, published heavily redacted reports. The people cheered. They didn't realize the real ghouls were the ones signing the legislation. Behind the scenes, false cases flooded the record books. Gangs that didn't exist. Entire crime syndicates fabricated from names pulled off census rolls. Bodies never recovered because they were never meant to be. In one particularly horrific incident, a series of murders in Baltimore was blamed on a roaming ghoul family. 5 supposed ghouls were publicly executed, photographed, displayed. But the photos, staged. The bodies, human, poor, disposable. The real ghouls, the ones who had orchestrated it, sat 3 blocks away in a municipal building, drinking imported wine and reviewing new acquisition requests from the Meat Reclamation Division of the City Sanitation Department. Presidents gave speeches condemning the violence. We will not rest until the ghoul threat is eradicated. Meanwhile, their cabinet was full of the very same. Press secretaries who didn't blink. Secretaries of state who never ate at banquets. Vice presidents who aged 10 years in office, then vanished from history without a trace. You can trace it back, if you look hard enough. Every ghoul panic followed by a spike in emergency funding. Every outbreak followed by just enough false arrests. Just enough carnage to make the people scared. But never suspicious. And so the country grows. Territories become states. Cities rise like stone teeth across the land. And beneath it all, the government continues to feed. Quiet. Efficient. Patient. The greatest trick they ever pulled. Convincing the world the monsters were out there. Not right here. Not in suits. Not behind podiums. Not wearing the flag. But they were. And they still are. Because the real ghoul problem isn't the one hiding in alleys. It's the one writing the laws. By 1866, the Union was whole again on paper. But beneath the healing, beneath the churches ringing peace and the speeches calling for unity, the soil was slick with more than rain. The South was in ruins. The North, triumphant but fraying. Slaves were freed legally. But the land wasn't free. And the people, they were meat wrapped in politics. The ghouls didn't care who won. Because they won either way. Reconstruction was chaos in a tailored suit. Freedmen camps were underfunded, unguarded, and unnoticed. Bodies disappeared, and when questions were raised, officials cited famine, disease, or exodus. But the ghouls were there already managing the logistics. They posed as government agents. Preachers. Doctors. They offered help, shelter, safety, and then they fed. In the industrial North, war production shifted to factories. Cities grew. Slums multiplied. And the ghouls moved in with the immigrants offering jobs, housing, and protection. As long as no one asked about the missing. They buried their feeding in labor disputes. Railroad strikes. Mining accidents. Tenement fires that left bodies too burned to count. Chicago. Pittsburgh. Cleveland. Each became hubs not just of steel and coal but of measured, regulated slaughter. All the while, newspapers printed the stories the ghouls wrote for them. Tragic warehouse collapse in Milwaukee, 40 Irish dead. Flood in Johnstown sweeps hundreds away. No bodies found. Yellow fever claims 300 in Mississippi, burials expedited for safety. But no one noticed that the names were always new arrivals. The poorest. The quietest. The ones no one wrote letters for. And now, in Washington, they were entrenched. The Freedmen's Bureau infiltrated. The new Federal Marshal's Service. Several were ghouls themselves, wearing tin stars and long coats to clean up after messy feedings. In Congress, 2 key lawmakers sponsored a bill for nationwide morgue standardization, complete with off-site storage and disposal contractors pre-selected and unnamed. One of those contractors was a shell company, registered to a man who had never been born, and hadn't eaten anything but bone marrow since 1812. By the 1870s, the country thought it was stabilizing. But in truth, it was being trimmed, shaped, structured into a nation-sized abattoir, clean, quiet, lawful. Because the ghouls weren't scavengers anymore. They were administrators. And America wasn't a country anymore. It was a feeding system with a flag.